Suicide bombings are never justified, according to a recent Pew Center poll. Next, a congressional hearing examines the threat of domestic terrorism. We'll hear from the executive director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. This House Homeland Security Subcommittee hearing is an hour 50 minutes.
The hearing will come to order. Almost 6 years after 9/11 and after countless intelligence briefings on the Hill, I am very unhappy to report that I still don't know what makes a terrorist. And not just any kind of terrorist, mind you, but terrorists who are either American citizens or legal residents who are here actively planning to murder their neighbors, who could be you or me or our relatives and friends, and, by the way, as many of us as possible. I ask, why does an American citizen like Russell DeFreitas allegedly conspire with an al-Qaeda-inspired cell of international terrorists to destroy JFK Airport and kill thousands of people by blowing up fuel storage tanks and pipelines? Why would a U.S. citizen and 2 U.S. residents conduct reconnaissance of Fort Dix in New Jersey and plot to kill, quote, as many American soldiers as possible, unquote, with mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, and guns, all, quote, in the name of Allah, unquote? And why did Adam Gadon, a Jewish kid from Southern California, go from being an alienated American teenager to an al-Qaeda sympathizer to the mouthpiece for Osama bin Laden, preaching hate and violence across the airwaves? I don't have the answers. I don't believe my colleagues have the answers, and the American people don't either. What I do know, however, is that I am chilled by what Dame Eliza Manningham-Buller, the former director of Britain's MI5, has said about the consequences of failing to get the answers and failing to act in time based on those answers. Last November, Dame Eliza revealed that in the United Kingdom alone, police and others within her organization, quote, are working to contend with some 200 groupings or networks, totaling 1,600 identified individuals who are actively engaged in plotting or facilitating terrorist acts here, that here means Britain, and overseas. You heard me right. Some 200 terrorist plots involving more than 1,600 British citizens planning to kill other British citizens, or, if we had not foiled the liquid bomb plot last summer, planning to kill up to 4,000 mostly American citizens traveling to the U.S. on U.S. planes. I am worried. We must learn from the UK experience and fix what needs fixing in this country before we find ourselves under the same threats as Britain is. An important step toward doing that, I believe, is to consider establishing a national commission on the prevention of radicalization and homegrown terrorism. While we potentially face similar problems as Britain, I am mindful of the fact that we are not the United Kingdom, and what we face may be different and less menacing. That is all the more reason for us to conduct an expedited but thorough study of what is happening in our country so we can find an American response to our American indigenous threat. The commission we want to discuss with our witnesses today could be modeled after the National Commission on Terrorism, which I served on in the late 90s, from 1999 to 2000. And which I believe produced a very important report predicting a major terrorist attack on U.S. soil. One of our witnesses, Brian Jenkins, was also involved in that effort, and I should say to our audience and our witnesses that on 9/10/2001, the Commission's chairman, L. Paul Bremer, Jerry Bremer, and I had lunch near the Capitol, wondering why no one was paying attention to our recommendations. A commission focused on radicalization and homegrown terrorism could get us up to speed quickly on the threat and help us assess whether a legislative strategy is needed to address it. The commission could also bring together the best minds in the nation from as many diverse backgrounds and experiences as possible. It could create a common strategy that not only shapes the action we take here, but also carves out a role for other stakeholders at the federal, state, and local levels. And I might add, we should probably assess what the private sector could be doing as well. I am eager to hear from the witnesses about the value of this approach, what issues it should address, and what recommendations it should make. And let me commend the ranking member, Mr. Reichert, whom we also call Sheriff Reichert, for being one of the early advocates for this approach. But let me be absolutely clear. When we talk about radicalization and homegrown terror, we're not talking about, I want to underscore this, people from one particular ethnic, political, or religious group. On the contrary, we're talking about anyone who might be engaged in ideologically based violence, whether by a U.S. Bronze Star honoree named Timothy McVeigh, or in Belgium, a female Catholic convert to Islam who traveled to Iraq and blew herself up, or in the UK, third-generation Britons of Pakistani descent who 2 years ago killed scores of their fellow citizens on buses and trains. I'm sure everyone on this subcommittee would agree that while taking on radical extremists who mean us harm, it would be wrong, it is wrong, to lump an entire community together for increased scrutiny simply because of their ethnic, religious, or national background. And it would be equally wrong, let me stress this, to pretend that there is no problem and hope for the best. The time for action is now. We will consider marking up legislation next week. What our witnesses share with us today will help us finalize our work and help save lives now and in the future. Welcome again to you all, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Reichert, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing and for your leadership on this issue. And just for the information of the audience and the panel present today, you have a committee with varying backgrounds and experience, and the chair referred to me as the sheriff. My experience comes from local law enforcement for the past 33 years. This is my second term here in Congress. The last 8 years of my tenure in the sheriff's office in Seattle was as the sheriff, elected sheriff there. And the rest of the committee comes, as I say, with a background in a variety of degrees and a lot of experience in Homeland Security efforts, intelligence efforts, and Department of Defense. And so you have a committee here that's really interested and willing to work with you in helping make this commission a successful event. And I want to thank you three for being here this morning, taking time out of your busy schedule to give us your insights and to answer some of the questions that we have to pose to you today. This subcommittee has focused intently on the issue of radicalization, as you know, and how it affects our security. Unfortunately, since that time, as we've been moving through this, we've seen radicalization and individuals involved in radicalism in plots against us, most recently against John F. Kennedy Airport. JFK plotters aimed to cause greater destruction than in the September 11th attacks by destroying the airport, killing several thousand people, and destroying parts of Queens. One of the United States citizens involved in the plot indicated that JFK was targeted because it is a symbol that would put the whole country in mourning, saying it's like you can kill the man twice. This is what we are dealing with, and unfortunately, the scope of the potential problem is huge. Radicalized cells can form in prisons, get together on the internet, meet and follow charismatic leaders, or any combination of the three. They can also decide to become a lone wolf to avoid detection. This example is especially noteworthy after the lone wolf shooting at the Jewish Federation in Seattle last summer. Radicalization is a complex phenomenon. It is essential that we understand the phenomena, especially on how these cells form and how they grow. In March of this year, I introduced H.R. 1605, the PREVENT Act, which would establish a national commission on the prevention of radicalization. And unlike most commissions like the 9/11 Commission, like the WMD Commission and the USS Cole Commission, which were formed after a major failure occurred, this commission would focus on mitigating problems leading to radicalization before a major attack occurs. I've been involved in all sorts of commissions over my careers at conferences and committees, and most of the time what happens is we get together, we talk, we write down some reports, and nothing is ever done. This needs to be a commission, an effort, some energy put toward where we actually have some meaningful findings, things that we can do, some action items that we can apply so that we can prevent attacks from occurring within the United States. And again, I thank all of you for being here. I thank you, Madam Chair, again for your leadership. And this truly is a committee that's worked in a bipartisan way to protect our nation and its people. Thank you very much. I yield.
I thank the ranking member and now welcome our witnesses. Let me note also that other members of the subcommittee under subcommittee rules can enter opening statements in the record if they so choose to. All of the witnesses on this panel are very well known to me, and I commend them for not only the excellent testimony they've submitted for today's hearing, but for the work they do in their day jobs on these issues. Our first witness, Brian Jenkins, is the senior advisor to the RAND Corporation and is one of the world's leading authorities on terrorism. He's a repeater. He testified at our recent Los Angeles hearing on the same subject. And I would also say he is the godfather. He founded the RAND Corporation's terrorism research program in 1972. That's not a typo. 1972. Has written frequently on terrorism and has served as an advisor to the federal government and the private sector on terrorism-related issues. In 1996, he was appointed by President Clinton to the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security. He also served as an advisor to the National Commission on Terrorism, the one on which I served, and as a member of the U.S. Comptroller General's Advisory Board. Our second witness, Mr. Salam al-Marayati, is the Executive Director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC, which is an organization that, among other things, plays a major role with the FBI regional office in Los Angeles. MPAC is a public service agency aimed at disseminating accurate information about Islam to the American public. The MPAC National Office in Washington, D.C. serves as the primary interface between the Muslim American community and U.S. government officials. MPAC has worked with the Departments of State, Treasury, and Homeland Security and the White House to offer guidance on issues that affect the United States and the Muslim community. Our third witness, Mr. Frank Cilluffo, is the Associate Vice President for Homeland Security at the George Washington University Homeland Security Policy Institute. That's a mouthful. Mr. Cilluffo leads the university's Homeland Security efforts on policy, research, education, and training. He directs the multidisciplinary Homeland Security Policy Institute, a think tank that advances Homeland Security issues. The Institute's recent policy and research agenda has spanned domestic terrorism, radicalization, disaster management, emergency preparedness, pandemic influenza planning, biodefense, intelligence, and information sharing. And if that's not enough of a nightmare, I'm sure we'll hear from him today about how we need to do even more. I would just add about Mr. Cilluffo, when I became, with the former House member Saxby Chambliss, I guess we were the co-chairs of, I'm not sure how it was defined, but anyway, of our House focus on terrorism following 9/11, we called a small panel together to advise us on what we should do, and Mr. Cilluffo was one of the people we turned to. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I would now ask each of you to summarize your statement for 5 minutes. There's a little clock that will be blinking at you if you violate my edict. And let us start first with Mr. Jenkins.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I want to thank you for providing me with another opportunity to address the issue of radicalization and recruitment to terrorism.
You need to turn your mic on or bring it closer to you.
There we go. Again, I want to thank you for providing me with another opportunity to address radicalization and recruitment to terrorism in the United States. In my April 5th testimony, I addressed the ways terrorists recruit and what we might do to improve it. Today, I'd like to focus my remarks on the specific proposal, that is the creation of a national commission on the prevention of violent radicalization and homegrown terrorism. As an historian and based upon personal experience, I believe that advisory commissions can be useful instruments for addressing difficult issues and providing new approaches. In the past, national commissions have helped the country navigate crises, define and address problems of domestic violence, and prepare for the growing challenge of terrorism. To go all the way back to the wave of assassinations and riots in the 1960s, the Eisenhower Commission on Violence in America in 1968 thoughtfully reviewed America's propensity for violence. It warned of a divided society. In 1983, the Long Commission convened to review the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, went beyond that, and it alerted the Pentagon and the public that terrorism had become another form of armed conflict for which our armed forces had to be prepared. Several commissions were convened in the 1990s to examine new dangers posed by terrorism. One after another, they issued sober findings. The Deutsch Commission warned of the diversion of weapons of mass destruction. The Bremer Commission warned of a large-scale terrorist attack in the United States. In many respects, that commission's report and the problems it identified proved prophetic. Its concerns were echoed by the Gilmore Commission. All three commissions agreed that the United States had to prepare for terrorist catastrophe. After the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon in 2001, of course, the 9/11 Commission was able to build upon this earlier work and the issues that the earlier commissions had identified to produce a national plan for improving our capabilities to combat terrorism. The 9/11 attacks were carried out by 19 terrorists who were radicalized and recruited abroad. But as the threat has evolved since, today we worry more about individuals in the United States who may respond to the continuing, and I should say increasingly sophisticated, incitement to violence emanating from al-Qaeda and its allies. And that's the challenge that the proposed commission would have to consider. In doing so, it would be required to address a broad range of questions. What do we know about radicalization and recruitment to terrorism in the United States? We talk about self-radicalization, but our actual cases show evidence of proselytizers, inciters, incubators, people who facilitate travel abroad for training for terrorism. Hardly self. What could be done about this infrastructure that supports radicalization and recruitment? Should we see recruitment as a societal problem calling for community intervention or a matter of purely personal choice? And if the former, what is the role of the communities where recruiting is occurring? And how would the affected communities frame the problem? What role, if any, would they propose? What's the role of the Internet? What lessons might we learn from the efforts of other nations? What are possible strategies for reducing recruitment to terrorism in this country And finally, what is the appropriate role of federal and local government? Tasking an advisory commission with assembling all we know and developing a framework for understanding radicalization and homegrown terrorism, therefore, in my view, is a good idea. Inevitably, it will lead to the identification of some specific threats and vulnerabilities and possible ways to fix them. Some of these will address issues of enhancing our local intelligence capabilities, updating legal mechanisms to deal with Internet-era technology. Those certainly should be done. Some will inevitably touch upon more sensitive areas, and here we do have to be cautious. Proposals that get us into the area of social engineering have to be very carefully analyzed for their intended and unintended consequences. Whatever we do to improve national security must be accomplished without degrading our enduring values or our inherent national strengths. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jenkins, for posing some very provocative questions and for the expertise you bring. Should we proceed with this idea, you are hereby enlisted. Mr. al-Marayati.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson and the Subcommittee on Intelligence, Information Sharing, and Terrorism Risk Assessment for inviting the Muslim Public Affairs Council to provide a voice for the mainstream Muslim American community on Homeland Security. We believe that the Commission is a very good idea that can address a number of very important issues, specifically identifying the relationship between the Muslim American community and the U.S. government. We believe that increased engagement with and the role of the mainstream Muslim American community should be understood within the broader strategy of protecting our country. The Muslim American community is an underutilized asset. We can partner with it and understand legitimate, authentic, and credible leadership as a key to countering extremism and radicalization. Preventing alienation of this group is also a key to effective policy making. Counter-extremism in many ways is tantamount to countering ghettoization, seen right now in European Muslim communities. And let me just add to this that the Muslim American story is a story of success. And we're dealing today with a very serious problem. But we should not dismiss many of the great contributions of Muslim Americans in business, academia, science, and the arts. We should not dismiss the Muslim American contributions in our armed forces and in law enforcement today. America offers equal opportunity to citizenship, an open society, an alliance with civil society, and a process for integration into pluralism. No other country today offers those opportunities for any of its minorities. America needs Muslims, and Muslims need America. We have a saying in our organization, home is not where our grandparents are buried, home is where our grandchildren are going to be raised. And for an effective counterterrorism strategy, the community should be involved as it is considering this a priority in protecting our home from any enemy. Therefore, community-based policing, similar to neighborhood watch groups, are effective in decreasing crime. The Muslim Public Affairs Council in 2004 offered the National Grassroots Campaign to Fight Terrorism that is built on three major components. One, to amplify Islam's message against terrorism, to fight bad theology with good theology, to counter the theology of death with the theology of life. Number two, to build partnerships between law enforcement and local Muslim communities, as the Muslim Public Affairs Council has developed an important dialogue with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies on this very important issue. And number three, to offer guidelines to Muslim institutions so that they can demonstrate their transparency and accountability to the American public. And we do this not for political reasons, but for Islamic reasons, based on the Quranic principle found in Surah 5, verse 32, that basically says the killing of an innocent human being is equal to the killing of all of humanity, and the saving of an innocent life is equal to the saving of all of humanity. We are here to save lives: Christian life, Jewish life, Muslim life, atheist life. And we counter the ideology of death with the ideology of life, but the ideology of life needs to have the platform and the arena and needs the assistance of government in raising its profile. Therefore, in doing so, I believe the American public can at least begin to appreciate that Muslim Americans are part of the solution, not part of the problem. In the FBI headquarters down the street, there's a quote that says, "The most effective weapon against crime is cooperation." The efforts of all law enforcement with the support and understanding of the American people. The U.S. government, therefore, needs to publicize the partnership it has developed with the Muslim American community, and not just publicize the arrests of fringe elements that are not necessarily part of the mainstream Muslim American community. Muslim Americans want to be treated as partners, not suspects. Let me just end by touching upon three important elements that we believe should be addressed by the Commission. Number one is the credibility of leadership. The term moderate has lost its impact and meaning. It is now interpreted by the Muslim American community as the one who has left Islam and condemns the religion wholesale, with this following logic, that the only good Muslim is an ex-Muslim. The Commission needs to include Muslims who are self-critical but not self-hating. The term moderate should describe those who believe in the change of the status quo and perhaps are anti-establishment, but in advancing towards change, renounce violence as an instrument of change. And support civic engagement, human and interfaith relations, and an understanding of Islam that is inclusive, not exclusive. Muslim youth need our support. In the several campuses throughout the United States, there are halal and Christian chaplaincies that support Jewish and Christian students respectively, but there is no similar support system for Muslim American students. Universities can also consider establishing a center for Muslim American studies that look into the development of integration of Muslim Americans. And finally, on the issue of Muslim youth, we need federal programs that train adults as well as youth on the difference between free speech and incitement to violence. Lastly, Islamophobia is a root cause of radicalization, and we need more of our government and political leaders to speak out against anti-Islamic rhetoric, not for the sake of civil liberties necessarily, but for the sake of keeping the Muslim American community engaged in all important policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I watched your neighbor to your left, Mr. Cilluffo, nodding through your testimony, Mr. al-Marayati, and I bet we're going to hear some reinforcement right now. Mr. Cilluffo.
Madam Chair, Congressman Reichert, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. And sitting next to my friend Brian and to Mr. al-Marayati, I do have to say they covered much of the waterfront, and I applaud the efforts of both and have worked with Brian for a number of years. But prevention of radicalization and homegrown terrorism is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and you should be commended for your strong leadership in examining and, more importantly, in acting on these matters. As Director of the Homeland Security Policy Institute at GW, much of my time and energy over the last 18 months has been directed towards the study of radicalization, in particular the processes by which people become radicalized, in prisons, over the Internet, here at home, and also abroad. Unfortunately, recent events such as the Fort Dix case, the Toronto 18, and the JFK plot remind us that there is no basis for complacency. The upside is that the domestic plots we have seen thus far have demonstrated intent, but not much in terms of capability. We would be foolish, however, to ignore the real possibility that both intent and capability may indeed marry up in the future. Testifying before this subcommittee last September, I presented the key findings and recommendations of a report on prisoner radicalization produced jointly by HSPI and the University of Virginia's SIAG. Our study recommended that Congress establish a commission to investigate the issue in order to better understand the nature of the threat and the baseline of activity and effectively assess current prevention and response efforts and recalibrate them accordingly. Radicalization, wherever it's occurring and through whatever venues, is only one subset of the battle of ideas and effective response strategies and tactics that need to extend beyond our borders. In fact, it's a bit of a misnomer to speak of homegrown terrorism. We live in a largely borderless world, and the threats that we face are transnational. Activity in cyberspace reinforces that point. In a second joint study, we looked at Internet-facilitated radicalization and found that Internet chat rooms are now supplementing and replacing mosques, community centers, and coffee shops as venues for recruitment and radicalization by terrorist groups such as al-Qaeda. A copy of our report has been submitted for the record. By incorporating and manipulating local political and economic grievances, some of which are legitimate, extremists have woven an effective tale of an imaginary clash of civilizations between the West and Islam. The extremists' compelling call to action, based partly on myths and falsehoods, begs for a development of an effective counter-narrative, one that unpacks, forcefully refutes, and powerfully responds to the extremists' own. The West is not at war with Islam, and terrorism is in fact un-Islamic. The real challenge for us here is to offer an alternative, a dream of sorts, and provide real opportunities for a better tomorrow to those who feel alienated and marginalized and who might otherwise be seduced by the extremist ideology. The U.S. needs to catch up in the cyber battle of words and ideas, to deconstruct the al-Qaeda brand campaign and turn it into nothing more than a passing fad. To succeed, of course, this means much more than slick marketing and framing of the message. Our words must match our actions. The bottom line is that radicalization is not a well-understood phenomenon. Greater study of the life cycle of a terrorist, when one goes from sympathizer to activist to indiscriminate violence, is needed in part to identify trigger points and possible points of intervention. With all this as background, your proposal to establish a commission is a necessary step to meet and defeat existing and potential threats to the United States. Your legislation will go a long way towards pulling together what is known in this field, identifying gaps and seams in our knowledge, and chart a more clear course ahead. That foundational research may then be used to better inform and shape policies. The importance of tapping knowledge and experience of both the public sector at all levels of government and private and non-governmental sectors needs to be emphasized. And while there is no one-size-fits-all approach to the challenge at hand, there still is substantial value in looking beyond our borders to the work done and lessons learned, or at least observed, by other countries. In fact, HSBI has inaugurated an Ambassador Roundtable series to do just that, and your legislation clearly recognizes all of this. It is important to note, though, that the role of government is limited in this context. The solution sets for this problem lie primarily at the grassroots level, in local communities where trusted and credible leaders can have real impact with their fellow citizens. That is not to say that government at all levels don't have a contribution to make. Cultivated mutual respect and understanding between officials and communities founded on a solid education about Muslim cultures and Islam is crucial. Let me emphasize that radicalization is not unique to Islam, nor is it a new phenomenon. Historically, extremist beliefs have been used to subvert the ideals of every major religion in the world, and Islam is one of those several. And they actually do run directly counter to the basic tenets of Islam, and most polls overseas would demonstrate that. Let me just get to two quick points. I know I've never had an unspoken thought, and I'm over the time. But I do think it's important that we appreciate the sensitivities and the perceptions of those who feel that they, their religion, an entire community are being targeted as a result of the extremist action of a fringe element. And I think you should really run with the protections you have there in terms of civil liberties and recognize that balance, and I applaud that. And I also think there are 2 points in particular that could be enhanced in the legislation. The first is it's not comprehensive of all the disciplines that need to be addressed. Behavioral science needs to have a front row seat at the table, as do social networking experts. This is largely a networking phenomenon, so people in the IT sector who can do that. And I would also suggest that since terrorists don't adhere to artificial timelines, and 18 months is an awful long way to go before you come up with a complete report, that you should have interim reporting requirements and draft that into the legislation itself. In closing, thank you for your leadership. HSPI stands ready to help however we can, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here with friends and colleagues.
I thank all the witnesses. Each of you has just made an additional contribution to this focus that we have had ongoing for some time. I'm hopeful that all of your testimony will be carefully digested by us and by staff, and that the legislation we look at next week will include many good new suggestions that you have just made. Each member will now have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I will first recognize myself for questions. My first question is about language, names. And let me say why I raise this. If we launch a commission and its name is something that offends many of the people we're trying to reach for, that would be a mistake. On the other hand, if we try to come up with some warm and fuzzy name that is not clear about what we're studying, I think that could be a disservice. So let me ask all three of you. Obviously, I recognize that Mr. al-Marayati has a lot to contribute to the answer, but all three of you do. About 3 terms: radicalization, each of you used it, homegrown terrorism, and ideologically based violence. What about these names, and I'm not sure in what order, but does any of these names give you heartburn in terms of a description of what we're trying to look at with this new commission? I'd appreciate an answer from all of you, starting with Mr. al-Marayati.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very important question, Congressperson Harman. And I don't have a problem, I don't think we have a problem with any of these terms. These are real issues that no one should be in denial of their manifestations. I think we have 2 problems in general in terms of terminology. The first is the selective application of terminology, and I think you covered that very well in your introductory remarks, that we're not talking about one particular religion. And indeed, homegrown terrorism did not begin just a few years ago, but with Timothy McVeigh, with Puerto Rican terrorists, with so many other examples of terrorism in the past. The other issue is affording religious legitimacy to extremists by using terms like Islamofascism, Islamic radicalism, Islamic terrorism. Number one, that is an inaccurate description, as I believe we agree the essence of Islam is against terrorism. There's no room for terrorism in Islam. Number two, when we give in to the extremists and let them use jihad or jihadi to describe themselves, we are giving them religious legitimacy and taking it away from the Muslim mainstream.
You'll note I did not use that term.
Exactly. So I just wanted to underscore and emphasize that point.
Gentlemen, you'll just
yes.
wait a second. What term would you use?
The terms that were used without religious labels: radicalization, terrorism, extremism, ideologically based violence. And I believe that that is a constructive way of establishing the dialogue with the Muslim American community on this issue. And you will find more constructive discussions on the issue.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Reclaiming my time. Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Cilluffo, would you comment on terminology, please?
Just 2 quick comments. I do think the term radicalization needs the adjective violent in front of it, because that will keep us out of some trouble in terms of conveying a wrong message that we are in any way attacking people's ideas here. Homegrown is a perfectly good term. However, in the actual conduct of the Commission's work, I think they would have to realize that in today's world, we do live in a global society, and so many of the issues that come into play here when we look at what we call homegrown radicalization, it involves Internet, which in fact is a global network. It may involve recruiters from abroad. It may involve going abroad for training.
Let me just interrupt you there. I take that point, and Mr. Cilluffo made it in his testimony, but a premise would be that there is something unique about the American experience, and we better understand that, because there are many more Americans here who could be radicalized than there are, let's just start with Americans abroad. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's why I would leave homegrown in the title of the Commission. But as I say, the Commission ranges more broadly in terms of how that feeds into homegrown terrorism.
Appreciate that very much. Mr. Cilluffo.
Well, Madam Chair, I do think words really do matter, and how we use those words are critical in determining our success, and this is not an academic exercise. I have no qualms with any of the terms you've identified. I would note, however, that, and this is not a political statement, but I don't use the term GWAT, for example, when looking at these issues overseas. That to some
GWAT is Global War on Terrorism?
To some extent, that empowers the adversaries we're looking at. I do use, I call it, and this is quite the bumper sticker made for TV, but it's a transnational insurgency underpinned by a global jihadi Salafist movement. Now, I do use the term jihadi, but in each case I will identify that it's being misconstrued by a small set of individuals. And if you couple the Salafists with the jihad, that is in large part what we're seeing. So I'm not taking that in isolation. But I very much agree with my colleagues' points. Let's not make them any more religiously codified than they should be, or they're not warriors. They're a bunch of things.
I thank you for your answer. My time has expired. The Chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your question. I think in my past line of work, again, I'll mention the use of words really does affect people. It touches their heart in so many different ways. And as a homicide detective for 13 years, in the beginning of my early career investigating murder cases, the term closure was used for families who had lost a loved one who was murdered. And we learned very quickly as we moved through some very important cases that there is never any closure, and it was deeply offensive to the families. They got answers to questions about their loved one's death, but they never got closure. So I appreciate the question from the Chair and your answers from the panel. It's also then important the people who are members and active participants of this Commission, and certainly there are recommendations made in the legislation. Do any of the three of you have any other thoughts besides, I know the behavioral science person recommended, any other thoughts on who should be participating in this Commission?
I think that the Commission would be well served to have, in addition to behavioral scientists, to have either as members or certainly as advisors or witnesses that would assist its work, those involved in intelligence issues, particularly at the local police level, because those are the people who directly interface with the various communities involved. I would, at some peril, suggest the inclusion of a lawyer, a constitutional lawyer. We're going to be touching upon any commission that addresses this is going to touch upon extremely sensitive issues involving free speech, religion, immigration, and therefore would do well to have the kind of guidance that can be provided by a federal judge or someone who is well versed in these matters. I would agree with Frank Cilluffo that our behavioral scientists should definitely include someone in the area of both individual motivations as well as social networks. So we have legal, we have behavioral, we have intelligence. Those, I think, would be essential components.
Thank you. Mr. al-Marayati.
Yes, in addition to what my colleagues have stated, I think what we need are experts for the community in terms of community-based policing to understand how to detect and how to intervene in cases such as Mr. Gadon that Congresswoman Harman stated. In that particular situation, could there have been intervention in the mosque with that individual? Because here's the dilemma. I could just be very frank with you about how Muslim Americans are feeling about the situation. If they intervene, they are afraid that law enforcement and those in the media are going to exploit the situation and say that they are associating themselves with terrorists. Not just in mosques, but also on the internet. People are afraid to go into these extremist websites because they don't want a law enforcement agent knocking on their door the next day asking them questions and misconstruing it as association with terrorism. So experts that can help in determining how to intervene in these situations would be very helpful. Number two, experts on Islamic ideologies of human rights and human decency, I think, are important to make these important distinctions and to explain it to the American public in a way that satisfies our First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, and separation of church and state, so that the American public, as was stated earlier, gets a greater level of confidence that we are providing some answers, not just talking about the problems.
Thank you. And
I would just add, Congressman Reichert, that I agree very much. The community policing is at the heart of this matter. It's not going to be decided here in the Beltway. And it can't only be in a counterterrorism environment, because that creates a defensive posture to begin with. It's got to be part of the larger community policing efforts. I also agree very much with Brian that the intelligence community, not only intelligence-led policing, but people who've had experience in understanding the opportunities and the limitations of intelligence from a national security standpoint. I also think those with experience in organized crime. To some extent, we've been uniting our adversaries when we need to start disaggregating, and I think that the role of that we played in Cosa Nostra, it was in large part because they started losing confidence in one another, and trust is the key to everything. Trust is the key to the good guys. Trust is the key to the bad guys. You start eroding some of their trust, maybe it starts falling apart. So I would highlight those. The other area I would highlight and accentuate is the international component. We have a lot to learn, and hopefully we don't learn it and have the same scar tissue that some of our friends overseas have. And I would like to see that somehow find its way into its findings. And then finally, of course, to have resonance, we need Islamic scholars. The solution sets in part are going to come from within the Muslim community, and to have resonance, that's who we need to look toward.
thank you for your answers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Dix of Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to give each of you a chance to talk about this subject. And first of all, I appreciate your testimony here today, and I want to compliment the chairman and the ranking member. We've gone around the country and looked at a few different situations. How big an issue is this? I mean, stepping back from, a commission, we got to get there's been commissions authorized by Congress before, and if the administration doesn't want to cooperate, that can be a problem. So I hope we can get cooperation. But how big a problem is this? And we know we got a terrible problem internationally. There's no question about that. And we know we have these specific examples. But just from your experience, the American people want to know, how major a concern is this?
Let me start with that, and at the risk of sounding Rumsfeldian, you don't know what you don't know. Where we have looked at this issue, where local law enforcement and federal authorities have examined it, we have in almost every case have been surprised to find out that there was more going on than we previously had imagined. The concerns, for example, about recruiting in prisons. These were not discovered until we actually began to look at the issue. And once we looked at the issue, we discovered there were things going on here. when there were increased intelligence activities as a consequence of 9/11, we discovered that, in fact, there was more activity going on than we previously had imagined. I don't want to exaggerate this. The country was not filled with sleeper cells, but certainly there was ample evidence of active radicalization and recruiting going on in the country. Now, thus far, based upon the conspiracies and clusters that we have uncovered since 9/11, there does not seem to be a significant cohort of terrorist operatives in the country. But there is active recruiting and there is the development of intent. And I want to make a point here about intent. The Hamburg cell had intent but no capabilities until they showed up in Afghanistan. The Leeds cell that carried out the bombings in London had no capability. They may have acquired some in a training camp somewhere. To move out of that realm of terrorism and to go back to Timothy McVeigh had intent and developed his own capability. Intent is the constant here. Capability is the variable. So when we look at these various conspiracies, the only difference between a handful of hotheads fantasizing about violence and somebody actually doing something that's going to result in dreadful carnage is the acquisition of this capability. There are lots of bunches of guys around the country that are fantasizing about violence. It only needs one of them, one individual in one of those clusters to have some capability, and we could confront what some of our allies have confronted on their soil.
Would the other members want to comment on this?
Yeah. From the community standpoint, we don't see a movement for radicalization. We don't see similar expressions of extremism like we have seen in Europe. And probably the reasons that we discussed earlier in terms of the level of integration here in America. American Muslims tend to be higher in terms of education than the average, higher in terms of income than the average, and definitely much better than those in Europe. If there are cells at this time, and if it is just one cell or one individual, that's one too many. So we are not looking at it in terms of whether there's a widespread movement for radicalization or not. However, we can identify the problem, and if we identify the problem in an effective, precise way, then that will help us towards a solution. If we identify the problem in a simplistic way, in a sweeping way, we believe that will exacerbate the situation. And the further you push young Muslims especially to the margins of society, then the more likelihood that they could be recruited by these extremist recruiters. So we should not even allow that situation to happen, and therefore the prevention of these social ailments in our society should be of utmost concern. Therefore, we should not impose the cloud of suspicion on young Muslim Americans today.
Can we finish this? Thank you.
Congressman Dix, I appreciate the question, and it is very difficult. I often say since the end of the Cold War, threat forecasting has made astrology look respectable, and I don't have a crystal ball. We simply don't know. But the question you do have to ask is how much is too much? And I would agree with my colleague that one is too much. And the last thing we want is to have hearings where us or anyone else or before you all, after an incident occurs, and there's going to be the knee-jerk attempt to take much more draconian measures, which are going to further push the issues to this, make it a bigger set of challenges. I might note, though, the UK asked those same questions prior to 7/7. And for anyone who's interested, I'm hosting Home Secretary John Reed on Monday for a speech and other things. But if you're interested, what they noticed in the 7/7 activities, which was quite alarming, is the speed and the pace of radicalization. We're talking months. We're not talking years. We're not talking many months. It was very rapid. So I think that we don't want the cures to be worse than the disease. We want to get out in front of this issue, and I can't quantify or qualitatively give you a concrete answer. But as Brian said, in all of our reports, the more we uncovered, the more we found. And clearly the messages are being targeted at a Western demographic and a young demographic.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Before yielding to Mr. Perlmutter, I just note that the British experience is somewhat different. There is a huge British Pakistani population that travels home for a month a year for family reunification purposes. Tens of thousands of people go to Pakistan each year, so there's an opportunity there for bad things to happen that I don't see a parallel for in America, which is another reason to study radicalization from the American perspective. The Chair now yields 5 minutes to Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for bringing your bill forward and convening this panel. We met in Torrance, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and I was hoping that the prison experience of Mr. Gadon were aberrations. And since then, we've had the Pizza Fort Dix experience, we've had Toronto, and just recently JFK. And so it's becoming more prevalent and, quite frankly, a little more frightening. But Mr. Cilluffo, you used a couple words that sort of resonated with me. You said these guys are not warriors, they're a bunch of thugs, I think you said. And maybe I heard it right.
My New York speak, sir.
Well, no, but I kind of I appreciate that. You also talked about the Cosa Nostra, the gangster kind of element to this. You know, gangsters may be more focused on economic, making money and that kind of power. This is more ideologically driven. But between that comment and Mr. Jenkins' comment about intent is the constant and capability is the variable, how do we, if you were both commission members, what would you be focusing on, based on your use of Cosa Nostra and thugs, but also taking into account his statement about intent is constant, capability is variable, if you please.
That's a complex question, and I'm not sure I have a quick answer for that, but clearly it is the convergence of bad guys and good stuff, and the good stuff being technology, capability, training, execution, and that training can occur anywhere. So what I meant by Cosa Nostra was also that terrorism is a team sport. The one that we haven't found a single profile, in fact, quite the contrary. The one thing we do know is that social bonds matter, and it's often friends, family, and those are very difficult to use conventional instruments to be able to respond to. But I do think in terms of organized crime, this is where we've worked on some of the federal, state, local interactivities, and I firmly believe that this isn't going to come from the Beltway. It's not going to come only from overseas intelligence. This is largely going to have to come from communities that are going to see when something's awry. So I do think we've got to focus on intent, but I also think that there's a lot of intent. The question is when do the two marry up with capability? And there we got a problem.
Mr. Jenkins, if my complex question made any sense to you.
It is a complex question. I'm not quite sure I've got it framed. I've got it framed right in terms of. Let me just put up here a note that agreeing with the other witnesses. In looking at this, I would say let's begin with the fact that right now we have a success story. We have a success story in terms of our ability as a nation to assimilate immigrants, to provide them with futures in this country, and therefore we do not confront the same problems that many of our European allies do. Second, we have a success story thus far in being able to identify and uncover some of these conspiracies that we have discovered. Not all of them have turned out to be significant in terms of capability, but as I say, certainly intent was there. So one of the things I would be focusing on, or advise the Commission rather to focus on, is that how can we enhance that success? How can we improve our local intelligence capabilities? How can we improve the relationships between police activities at the local level, I emphasize at the local level, and the various communities, and avoid doing things that are going to have counterproductive effects, and that is by isolating, alienating, stigmatizing, and angering that same potential reservoir of recruits that the terrorist ideology is going after. So how can we take advantage of our inherent strengths in this country, add some capability, and ensure that we are not going to spoil that? That's especially important, by the way, if, heaven forbid, an incident should occur. Having good intelligence and knowing what is going on and having good relations is going to prevent the country from propelling itself into a series of measures that, in fact, will imperil all of our civil liberties.
Thank you.
Could I just add?
Yeah, I would. Is it okay, Madam Chair?
Very quickly. We mentioned intent and capability, and also I think the overriding factor is our capability to intervene, as my colleagues have stated. And if we look at the model that was stated before, sympathizer to activist to violent radicalization, the intervention point is in the early stages, when they are sympathizers. The mechanism for intervening is ideological intervention. And so, and just to share with you internally what is happening in the Muslim American community, there is a training of religious leaders to intervene in a healthy, constructive way to make sure that sympathy is addressed within the Islamic context, that you cannot sympathize with murder, you cannot sympathize with wholesale violence, and number two, that these individuals who are being trained need to be empowered and need to be given the resources to make sure that we prevent the further stages of radicalization.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I just would like the record to be clear that we're talking about sympathy with violent action, not sympathy with any particular religion or religious tenets.
Exactly.
Unequivocal.
Exactly.
Chair now yields 5 minutes for questions to Mr. Shays of Connecticut.
Thank you. I think there are two inconvenient truths in the world, the one that Al Gore talks about and the other that the 9/11 Commission talks about. I think it is an incredible statement and showed some courage that the Commission said we're not confronting terrorism as if it's some ethereal being. We're confronting radical Islamist terrorists. And one, I want to know if you agree with that, each of you. And secondly, I want you to tell me what you think our country's strategy is to deal with this threat, if you think it exists. The Cold War threat was contain, react, and mutually assured destruction. So I'd like you to tell me, one, if you agree with what the 9/11 Commission said, and secondly, what you think our strategy is to deal with that threat.
Want to start?
All right. First of all, I think the threat is real. There's no question about it. And second, in terms of the radicalization process.
The threat is real is not what I asked.
Yeah.
Do you agree that we are confronting not that it's real, there are a lot of real threats. They highlight this as a major concern of the United States.
Yeah.
It is the principal,
Right.
it is the principal threat that we face in this country right now,
Okay.
and I suspect that we will face for decades.
Thank you.
We are talking about a phenomenon that cannot be dealt with by driving tanks across the desert and,
Right.
and reaching
Okay.
Baghdad.
So what's our strategy to deal with it?
I'm critical of us here. I think that we understandably, right after 9/11, focused our efforts on degrading the operational capabilities of our terrorist foes. We had to do that because we didn't know if another 9/11 was in the pipeline at that moment. But what we have not done, what is far behind, is our understanding of and our strategy for dealing with the front end.
So what is the strategy?
We don't have a strategy.
What should the strategy be?
The strategy should be intervening in the radicalization and recruitment process before they reach the stage of terrorist operatives. At that point, unless we can interrupt that radicalization and recruiting process, we are condemned to a strategy of stepping on cockroaches one at a time. We're going to be doing it forever.
Could I
Sure.
take a...
I want all three of you, Jones.
Sure. Ambassador Edward Jerigian in the late 80s or early 90s said we needed to have a dual-track approach. Number one, bring culprits to justice. So intelligence, incarceration, prosecution, conviction of criminals is one important track. And then the second track is to deal with the root causes and the social factors that lead to what Mr. Jenkins has aptly identified as the radicalization process. So our strategies should be a dual-track approach. I agree with the 9/11 Commission that it is a Muslim task. And if it's a Muslim task, then there are internal issues within the Muslim community, and there are national and international issues that deal with relations between these Muslim communities and their governments and their law enforcement that we can get into more specifics later. I just disagree with the nomenclature and the terminology because we do not want to give more religious legitimacy to the terrorists than they're already trying to attain. Thank you.
Mr. Shays, I would actually agree with both of my colleagues here, but let me put it a little different way. Clearly, it's the greatest threat facing the United States today, and others can exploit asymmetric means as well to take the United States on, which they can't do tank for tank, plane for plane, in a traditional war on a conventional battlefield. But let me say that I think the time has come to recognize we've got to stop only attacking the structure and start attacking their strategy. This is a battle of ideas. There's only one side on the battlefield right now, and it isn't us. And our diplomacy efforts should not be about projecting American values. It should be about debunking and unpacking their narrative to demonstrably show how it's misusing and distorting a religion. I would also add that when looking at our overseas function, my simple philosophy in 2 seconds, because I know my time's going to cut off, but we've got to isolate the military and operational planners from the organization, organizations from one another, that from a movement, and that from society writ large. Every step of the way, there are different instruments of statecraft that have to be brought to bear. Heretofore, the emphasis has been on the kill and capture, and that's where Congress is spending the money as well. So I think we need to look to how we can marshal other instruments of statecraft, not suggesting that the military component isn't important. It is part of it, but we need to get other instruments to the fore.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Dent of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the issue that you were just talking about of radicalization and religious arguments, how would you recommend that we deal with these religious arguments, I guess? You know, many of these Islamic extremists have been motivated by religious arguments. Is it incumbent upon moderate Islamic clerics to help de-radicalize? How do you think the Commission should address that specific question? I can talk maybe either one of the two of you.
Well, go ahead. I do think we need to, when I give public speeches on these sorts of issues, I always ask the audience, who's often an informed one, and I'm not going to ask for an answer here because I know I'm in the seat of taking questions, but how many people can tell me how many statements Osama bin Laden has made? How many people have actually read them? You'd be surprised at how few hands I will ever see raised. Before we can come up with a counter-narrative, we have to understand what the narrative is. Why is it having resonance? Why is it sticking? And that's where I think stage one, let's understand, forgive the bad pun, what makes them tick. Then we've got to identify what a compelling counter-narrative is, and that is going to have to a large extent be driven or at least communicated from within the Muslim community. The Quran is arguably the most important instrument we have to show how it's being distorted by others. Islamic scholars cultural experts, and we need to provide an opportunity for others to have a better tomorrow. That's all part of it. And I don't think we have done that. And in fact,
So would the commission, this type of commission, you think would be wise to engage the moderate Islamic community to help debunk these?
Unequivocally. I don't like the term moderate Muslim either.
Or whatever,
As a
whatever
Catholic,
term.
I'm not a moderate Catholic. I'm a Catholic.
Yeah, understood.
Understood. Yeah, I think we should empower Muslim religious authorities who are speaking about the ideology of Islam that looks at Jews and Christians as people of the book, not as infidels, that looks to human beings, other human beings, as the Quran stated, we have created you with human dignity. The children of Adam are created and bestowed with human dignity, and talks about the role of Muslims and Islam within the modern era, not something that we have to replicate from the 15th century or the 10th century or before then, but looking at modern issues of human rights, of democracy, of coexistence, of something that's very different from when Islamic civilization was at the top. In other words, we live as Muslim minorities here, and the Muslim world is a very different Muslim world than it was 1,000 years ago. Let me just add to that, and I think my colleague was alluding to this, that there have been polls done of Muslim mainstream communities about violence. Those who supported violence use political arguments. Those who oppose violence use religious arguments.
Interesting.
And so we have to be aware of that narrative in order for the counter-narrative to be effective.
That's well said. And my next question to you, is it Mr. Cilluffo?
Correct.
I just wanted to be, you've, I think, been quite a bit involved with prison radicalization. What do you think the Commission should do with respect to our penal system and the radical Islamic movement that is currently going on in many prisons?
You know, that's a long answer, but let me suggest that part of the solution there, again, is getting Muslim chaplains who can actually use the faith that prisoners themselves have been distorting, and prisons have always been incubators for radical ideas.
Right.
I mean, whether you're looking at Adolf Hitler writing Mein Kampf, whether you're looking at Joseph Stalin filling the ranks of the Bolshevik Revolution, and I can give many other examples. It's always been an incubator for radical ideas. You've got a captive and a captured audience with a lot of time on their hands. But I think a lot of the emphasis heretofore has been on the Federal Bureau of Prisons. That's a very small percentage of our prison population.
I agree. It's most state and county.
92% state and county prisons and jails. California, Madam Chair, has done a phenomenal job. We use them as a case study. LA County, PD. Those are the models we should be looking at, and I can go ad nauseum.
Yeah, my time is about up, but for maybe a later round of questioning, when should we intervene with this radicalization process? How should we go about that? And my time's up. I don't know if you want to take that in the next round.
If I might point out to Mr. Dent, that question was asked in a slightly different form a little bit earlier. So we are going to go to one more question each. That seems to me to be about the right period of time. And if you'd like to ask that question at that point, you should feel free to, but we do have a fairly full record. I just point out to Mr. Cilluffo that the cell that was arrested in Torrance, the site of a prior hearing where Mr. Jenkins testified, was radicalized in Folsom State Prison. So while I'd like to give California a lot of credit, there's still a lot of work to do. We'll go to a partial second round now and ask those members who wish to ask one additional question, starting with Mr. Reichert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will make mine quick. We talked about keeping it simple, and we've had a lot of discussion about community, working together, education, community-oriented policing. I just wanted to ask the panel if any one of you are aware of a program called Cops and Culture. The National Crime Prevention Council, the King County Sheriff's Office, when I was the sheriff, implemented that program in King County along with the Seattle Police Department, and I think it might be a tool that can be used in this effort Mr. Cilluffo, you go ahead.
Absolutely. There are three ways local police are going to be able to address this. One is through routine criminal investigations that then take other directions. That was the case in Torrance. The second is through community policing, relationships with the community, so that communities are comfortable in a relationship with the police and provide information. And the third is through dedicated intelligence efforts. That is a portion of police resources with federal assistance, specifically focusing on areas of concern.
Another point to underscore and reinforce your theory, Congressman Reichert, is where we have seen plots occur in terms of violence against the United States in the name of Islam. We've also seen that there are Muslims who are key in unfoiling those plots. And the UK terror plot would not have been stopped had it not been for a responsible Muslim British citizen stepping forward to the authorities and letting them know about this plot. So the key in community policing is the partnership and the cooperation and the comfort level with the community so that they can share information with our law enforcement without the fear of reprisal, without the fear of stigmatization.
Well, specific to this program, it really gets into educating the local law enforcement agencies about the cultures and the ethnic groups that they are serving.
Exactly.
Which is
Congressman Reichert, I think that's an excellent program, and there are others that we need to be building upon, because it all comes down to trust.
Yes.
It's all trust, and it's individuals. These are human beings, and you need people who can feel comfortable talking to another individual, and that is all based and contingent upon trust, and it's going to have to come from the bottom up. My Latin teacher, if he's still around on this earth in 4th grade, will probably kill me because I'll butcher the words, but there's a term, audiatur et altera par, which basically means let the other side be heard. And I think we need to be listening, not only doing, but I would also add that law enforcement at the local level, I don't think has the analytical capacity right now, or the breadth, or the depth. And there's still this belief that Washington's going to come down with that silver bullet when and where something will occur. You know what? We've never done indication and warning intelligence well, but I think we've got to get down to brass tacks, requirement setting. What do I need? What do I have? How can I provide that information? And ask the questions from both the federal and the state and local. But community policing is even more important in that equation.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentleman and might suggest that Latin proverb apply to Congress. Chair now yields to Mr. Dix for one additional question.
You know, you mentioned and Stalin. There is a history in the United States of radicalization. This isn't the first episode of this. I mean, so I think we need to take that into account as we look at this. And it's a very important phenomenon. And I guess the prison issue, Mr. Cilluffo, if you'd like to go on a little bit further about this prison aspect to this, what's good, what's bad. I mean, you know, the one thing about a commission that it kind of forestalls doing things. My view is, you know, I don't want to wait for a commission. I mean, we ought to have a commission, but I'd support that. But I think there's things we can be doing now, especially on this prison issue, where we can make some progress forward. So, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you, Congressman Dix. We did look at white supremacy. We did look at other gang activity of every stripe and ilk, and came to conclude that the activity is the activity. The modus operandi is the modus operandi. Some that were converting to Islam, which conversion is arguably a very good thing. The problem is you've got those that can manipulate that, and they have little to no knowledge coming in about the faith. So they can easily be co-opted by a charismatic leader, which was the case in California. And when I was talking about the best practices in California, I was actually talking post New Folsom, because then they actually started providing the Joint Regional Intelligence Center. JRIC was part of that intelligence stream. That the Bureau of Prisons was being looped into the whole process, and until then, they were treated to a large extent in isolation. So we've got a lot to do in terms of the prison systems, and a lot of that is information. But first and foremost, it's a priority-setting issue. If you're in charge of a prison and you're worried about gang activity and getting stabbed on a daily basis, it's very difficult, and we're already overcrowded and overpopulated, and they've got more than their handful of challenges. To throw yet another set of issues onto an already full list is difficult. So part of that is raising awareness. And what I'd like to see is a confederation of not only the FBOP, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, but I'd like to see that much better looped into the state prisons and county jails where much of the activity is occurring.
And I think one of the issues in terms of Muslim chaplains is looking at the rate of bringing Muslim chaplains into the prison system. To my understanding, it's been frozen. There have been no additional Muslim chaplains added since the case of Captain James Yee in Guantanamo. Number one. Number two, we have seen in various studies that religion, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, in the prison system is a positive force for prisoners so that they don't return to crime after they leave the prison system. So just in general, I think we need to look at how religion plays a constructive role in the prison system.
Could I build on that, Madam Chair, just for one second? Because it is the integration into society where you have those points where we were talking about intervention. That is absolutely critical. Many convert for protection. We called it Prislam. We had a couple of imams who referred to it as jailhouse Islam, and they get better food. So part of it is it's really going to be at that exit, at that facilitation. That's where we have to actually spend more resources in general in the prison system. And I would note that most major prisons are not in urban areas, so in many cases you're not going to have a very large Muslim community to begin with, so it's hard to get to the prisons.
Can I just,
Sure.
one comment here quickly, and stepping out of the issue of prisons specifically, we have had examples in our history of domestic radicalization to violence and terrorist activity in this country. The difference now, however, since previous waves, say in the 1960s or 1970s, is that the means of communications have developed, and we are now facing a foe that has been very sophisticated in using the most modern means of communications to convey a message, to create a community, a sense of belonging to something. We have to deal with that threat, but other radical groups will learn from the use of these techniques and adopt them to their own means. Yeah. So we're dealing with something, we've dealt with this historically, but we're dealing with something new today.
Thank you.
Mr. Perlmutter, for one question.
Thanks, Madam Chair. You said that in such a way that maybe, can I put like 4 questions into one question like I did last time? The question I have, and Mr. Jenkins, you were sort of hitting on it, there's a different way to communicate that's much broader and maybe more potent. Is there an age group that is particularly susceptible to this? You know,
it is the same age group. Yes, there is, and it's the same age group that is susceptible to being recruited into gangs. It's the same age group that is susceptible to being recruited into a lot of things. We're talking about primarily young men in their teens on up into their early 20s. These are young men who are going through, in many cases, just because of the age, identity crises, looking to define themselves because of their age again, lots of energy, lots of hormones. That is the age bracket that commits crime in this country. That's the age bracket that goes into gangs. It's what young men do. And unfortunately, if you have a narrative that exalts violence, that attempts to project that violence as a personal obligation, that justifies it, that offers the tantalizing prospect of clandestinity, identity. All of those are very appealing to that specific age group.
Thank you.
If I could just pick up on the issue of identity then, and this connects with Mr. Dent's question in terms of intervention. This is where we are intervening now, and we need to be more proactive and provide more resources in developing a healthy Muslim American identity, that America is home, that we counter ghettoization within the Muslim American community, whether it's psychological ghettoization or any other form of ghettoization. And in doing so, we will prevent this form of antisocial behavior of this group. And antisocial behavior could be manifested in drugs, in promiscuous sex, or in joining groups with violent ideologies. So the root cause here is an identity crisis that we have to address.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Shays, one question.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. First off, an excellent panel. I really wish we were going to spend more time because there's more that we could learn. I think it's instructive that none of us really could state what our national strategy is, yet we could state what the Cold War strategy is. And that, to me, is what we need first as a huge national dialogue about what we're confronting. In the short run, it's got to be detect, prevent, preempt, and sometimes act unilaterally. And you may call that getting the cockroaches, but it's got to be that. And then we fill it in with other things that we did during the Cold War with Sputnik and education and so on to compete economically with Russia. But what I just want to say, and I want your reaction, is I find it repugnant, having just finished reading Elie Wiesel's The Night last night, that I would have to speak to or deal with people who are so sick that they would literally wrap themselves in a weapon and blow up themselves in front of children. And somehow dealing with that is striking me as incomprehensible. And it may be a disconnect that we have, but it's somehow like we have to kind of negotiate, deal with. I just react to it.
I agree, Mr. Shays. This is a sickness. It is a psychosis. It is something that the average human being, the normal human being, cannot comprehend. And we have to address it objectively and effectively. There is an ideology of suicide culture that is taking on a cloak of religion. And I think what we are all saying here is that we have to understand the development, the metamorphosis of this suicide culture. We really have not invested enough in the ideological battle against this suicide culture. So we should do that, and also we have to listen to the mainstream. We are not listening enough to the mainstream Muslim communities. Our policies have isolated the mainstream Muslim American communities, who, like you and I, cannot explain why there is a suicide culture in the name of their religion right now. And we should also speak out more against Islamophobes like Pat Robertson, who said yesterday that Islam is not a religion, but it is a movement for worldwide domination. When they hear that message from a religious leader, they view that as a message that is closely associated with the U.S. government, as a friend of the U.S. government. So we need to also address how to deal with our own extremists here in America who are fomenting anti-Islamic rhetoric and how they exacerbate the situation.
Mr. Shays, could I just add to that? I certainly would hope no one at this table would suggest negotiating with people who would actually take those steps. That's very different. Again, getting to my isolate military and operation planners organizations from other organizations, that from a movement, that from society. It's that second ripple effect that I'm most concerned about, those that are potentially teetering on the edge and can go one way or the other. Dealing with the military and operational planners, we're going to have to use the heavy instruments of government. covert action, law enforcement, military, string them up, string them along, I don't know, case-by-case basis. But it's that next tier of folks, that's the group we're potentially losing. And we wrote a major report on the narrative and the counter-narrative, so obviously I agree with everyone here, but it's also worth noting it's not what you say, it's what people hear. And we have to understand what they're hearing.
I want to underscore that. Once they strap on a bomb and become a weapon, that is obviously not the point for having discussions about identity and radicalization. They are a weapon and must be dealt with that as such. The point of intervention is to try to do things that is going to reduce the reservoir of those who will be caught up in this narrative, which is essentially an ideology of death. This is an ideology that exalts death. It connects the individual with some glorious utopian past, which may or may not have existed, and promises them earthly pleasures in some future life, leaving the now, which is nothing, and therefore enables an individual to simply turn themselves into a weapon and think of themselves as nothing more than a weapon. We have to be able to intervene to ensure that there's not going to be a large reservoir of those that can be recruited to that.
And can I just add one point? Because it is that reaffirmation, that moral equivalency, that people then will be emboldened to actually act. That's that reservoir we have to keep flipped on the other side.
And also, there's the terrorist, and then there are audiences. And terrorists try to influence audiences. And we should embrace and engage the audiences. The terrorist is not somebody we need to negotiate. You're right. We are not here to understand or develop an agreement with a terrorist.
Thank you.
They should be handled swiftly and with justice.
Thank you. The good news is that I need to leave now, but Mr. Dix will take over the chair, and if our members have additional questions, we can go until noon, assuming the witnesses can stay. I just want to observe that this is one of the best panels we have ever had, and that what you have just said will directly influence a legislative proposal which we are working on now to set up a national commission, but not only that, perhaps some other legislative initiatives, which I believe this committee on a unanimous basis, that would be a miracle in this Congress, but on a unanimous basis will embrace. And for once, you know, Congress is accused of more heat than light. We might actually shed some light on a very serious set of problems. So I just personally want to thank our witnesses and our members for an enormously productive hour and a half.
Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I concur with her remarks. This has been an extraordinarily helpful hearing. I'm sorry I didn't get here for the beginning of it. The media, the Internet, and religion, I think we all can agree, play a role in radicalization and hopefully the prevention or the mitigation of radicalization. Given our First Amendment, how do we, as a government and a society, effectively combat all these radicalizing forces that you gentlemen have so eloquently discussed here today?
Two things with regard to that. First of all, combating what is taking place on the Internet or in other communications media doesn't necessarily mean controlling or restricting. It means that is simply the new terrain of battle. That's where we're going to fight. It means having counter-narratives. It means taking advantage of those same communications channels. Indeed, the irony of this is that this nation, which invented the Internet, which is so creative in exploiting communications for commercial and political purposes, has been so flat-footed in engaging those same means of communications to deal with this problem. So we can engage it without necessarily impinging upon the First Amendment. In some areas, however, I think that we do look at appropriate controls. For example, I mean, it's interesting that they are now talking about putting controls on the Internet to reduce fraud on sales through eBay. We control the Internet to deal with issues of child pornography, other things. So the fact that it is simply this thing called the Internet doesn't mean that we cannot appropriately update our laws and concerns to deal with specific problems.
As you answer this question, could you also just address, the role of the government in terms of on the Internet? Who's going to put up these religious arguments? Is that the government's role? Whose role is that as part of this?
It's the Muslim American community's role, or the Muslim community's role, to put up these arguments. And I think what we need to discuss in terms of cooperation between these communities and the government, where the community doesn't feel stigmatized if they enter an extremist Internet chat zone to argue against extremism, or to intervene with a potential radical or a sympathizer of radical ideology in the community or in the mosque, so we don't shut these individuals from our communities and then they become ripe for the pickings of extremist recruiters. So I don't see a problem in the First Amendment here. If the government were promoting Islam in any way, that's the problem, and that is not what we seek. I think what we're talking about is understanding the Muslim world and the Muslim Western communities in a more nuanced way, with a little bit more precision, more accuracy, so that will help us socio-politically and empower us in the tools against extremism.
Let me pick up on a couple of those points, and this is something we've written a lot on, so I'll try to be brief, not my strong suit again. But when we're looking at who the solution sets are, we can't look at this, Mr. Shays, I think, as a grand strategy. We actually have to look at it from a decentralized perspective, which is very difficult for government to do, and government only has a small role in this overly complex set of issues. Shutting websites down, it's like whack-a-mole. Hit it here, it's just going to pop up somewhere else. Quite honestly, the websites aren't even the issue. We need to get into the chat rooms. It's the chat rooms that are replacing the smoke-filled bars of the Le Carré novels where espionage used to occur. That's where it goes from the cyber world to the physical world. That's where they actually start connecting. We've got to be in there in a hand-to-hand kind of way, demonstrably showing how people are misusing the Internet. The other thing is I agree with Brian, greater transparency is also the solution here. We've got the ideas on our side, let's use them, and make sure we're doing that directly. And there's a program, and I'm not suggesting that all their programs are very good, but the Saudis have a program called the Tranquility Program, where they're actually going onto the Internet chat rooms, and they're bringing in Islamic scholars to refute how they're being misused. We've got to start thinking about that. And then on the counter-narrative, we all hear about terrorists and their martyrs. Well, it's about time some of our martyrs be remembered, and we've got to remind the terrorists, and they're trying to create this clash of civilizations, West versus Islam, who's being killed by terrorist bombs, largely Muslims. So how can they, in their own defense, make these sorts of cases? We've got to remind people that. Beslan, hundreds of kids being killed. I couldn't think of a more powerful, motivating attack to abhor terrorism. We need to start reminding people and showing the graphic visuals. The bombings in Jordan at the wedding, which actually was al-Zarqawi's undoing, I think, in the long run. That had negative consequences. Obviously, it was a horrendous attack, but we've got to start packaging that. Casablanca, but I can go on and on and on and on. They are packaging it very effectively. We haven't, and I think that is part of this counter-narrative.
And just following up on that, does the government play a role in this? I mean, is this the State Department? I mean, are they supposed to be involved in this ideological struggle on the Internet or in the chat rooms? I mean, is that the way to do it, or does it have to be done all outside of government?
No, it doesn't. You know, during the Cold War, we had something called the United States Information Agency. It was an institution that was set up to basically conduct a war of ideas with our adversaries in the Soviet Union. That doesn't mean that the government itself, that some government official was the author of every message, but it was a way of facilitating messages to get to audiences. The government has been involved in sponsorship of things like Radio Free Europe and other communications mechanisms. The problem we have now is that we do not have in this country any institution which brings together these various components of what we're trying to do in State Department, Defense Department, and elsewhere in terms of communications. We don't have a single point to focus our efforts. We don't have a strategy. And therefore, we are still grappling with this particular issue. But we've done this during World War II. We have done this during the Cold War. It's a matter of learning some new lessons and perhaps remembering some old ones and creating mechanisms that can facilitate this ideological combat.
And I don't know of a single instance where there's been a meeting of all of these components in a single setting to develop the strategy. Yeah. So I think the government can help in at least hosting these discussions that are needed with all these components now looked upon in a central manner. Number two, I think the government needs to start publicizing, as Mr. Cilluffo said, we need to look at the heroes on our side, on America's side, and those people who have been on the front lines battling this extremist ideology, they need to be empowered. And therefore publicizing the relationship between, for example, the Justice Department or the State Department with these Muslim American individuals and Muslim American institutions is critical. And lastly, there are exercises of government that have impeded the progress of the ideological battle, and we need to look more closely.
Well, and I would say, you know, and not to be partisan here, but Abu Ghraib is an example, I would think, that hurt America's reputation and image in the world and helps the other side, you know, from my perspective.
Exactly.
Mr. Chairman, it's not to suggest that government has a role. I don't necessarily agree that it's the same role with our counter-concealment deception programs and ideological programs vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, just because I think we've got so many other actors in a non-state-on-state kind of environment that it is different. But what we really do need to be doing is enabling and empowering and packaging. How many people in this room can tell me that they know that a number of Muslim associations in the United States issued a fatwa denouncing terrorism shortly after 9/11? Very few people. While there have been thousands of such groups, but no one hears them. So we need to make sure that someone's packaging that, not just in the United States, overseas as well. And I would say there was a 60 Minutes episode not too long ago that I thought was very powerful. Hassan Butt, who was one of the primary al-Qaeda recruiters for the 7/7 bombers, turned. But he came out denouncing terrorism, saying he got duped by al-Qaeda. That individual is going to have much greater impact and resonance on a potential recruit than I would or anyone else would. I just look at my own children when I try to explain things. If I use the Disney Channel, they get, and PBS. But point being, we need people who have credibility with the constituencies we're trying to work with, and the government has a role. We have a covert action role we have to play in the shadows. I'm not sure we're doing that very effectively. And we also have a role in empowering others, but that's not going to be the solution.
Mr. Shays.
Yeah, a great segue, though, from Abu Ghraib, which was talked in this country for months and months and months and months. It was an outrage, and we should have made it clear it was an outrage. It was talked in Al Jazeera for months and months and months and years, and yet when there were 50 people found in a torture chamber outside of Baghdad with, you know, drills holed, tortured for months, it wasn't even a front-page story in this country, and it certainly wasn't covered overseas. And when I read Al Jazeera in English and see it covered there, it is an outrage, describing what American soldiers do. And I know for a fact they were giving candies to kids, being lured out, and then they're getting blown up. It is an outrage how Al Jazeera covers what we're doing there. And I'll just make another comment, and like your comment to that. I am not impressed with most of the denunciations by the Muslim community against terrorism, because they always have a but. And the but is, but, you know, we have problems in Israel with Palestinians, but we have this, but the Western world needs to do this. There is no but to terrorism. And I'd like to see some of these denunciations without the word but, and then an explanation.
I don't think there was a but in the reference to Mr. Ciluffo's fatwa against terrorism.
That's the extreme example.
No, I think that's actually the rule, Mr. Shays, not the exception.
Well, you know what? Then I would like that documented to me.
Sure, we can provide you with all the documentation.
Yeah. Not a paragraph that follows, if there's not a but, a paragraph that then says, but the Western world needs to get with it.
No, I don't think anybody's adding the but. I think maybe you or your staff needs to look more closely not to add the but.
Well, no, you know what? I did look closely because I followed it. It was my committee that followed it after September 11th. And we heard a few, but there were more buts than there weren't. And I stand on that.
Let's look at that together, and we'll clarify that for you in terms of the important denunciations of terrorism as just an absolute. Number one. Number two, in terms of media, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think there should be a panel in terms of how the media, international media, domestic media here, plays a role in exacerbating tensions between the United States and the Muslim world. And we can have a whole panel on that discussion as well.
Mr. Dent. You all done? Okay. Mr. Perlmutter.
Just a comment. I assume we're winding this down, but I would hope that each and every one of you, if you were asked, would be a commission member or advise this commission that we're putting together, because it's important. Things seem to be speeding up here. You know, it is a very, vulnerable or open age, that group, and that group moves fast. I have 3 in that age category, and they are reading everything, watching everything, and they move quickly. And so I just thank you all for your time and your expertise.
Mr. Dent.
Mr. Chairman, real quick, I just want to follow up on what Congressman Perlmutter just said, that as this commission moves forward, I hope these 3 gentlemen have some role in it. This has been an enormously helpful hearing for me.
I agree.
Thank you. Yield back.
Let me ask you just one final question. On the question of the Internet, you suggested that there Congress is looking at various restrictions. I mean, are you suggesting that, a restriction on violent contact when you take radicalization to violence, that would be limited?
In terms of that has to be defined, and I think that's something we want to look at very carefully. So I don't want to jump ahead to the conclusion before we look at what are the reasonable possibilities. But to provide, for example, direct instruction, not only incitement, but specific instruction. This is how you make bombs, and this is how you should place the bomb. And when even in any other media, incitement is not protected by free speech.
That's right.
There
That's
is
the point.
an anticipation that it's going to lead to criminal action. So to provide incitement and instruction with a reasonable expectation that somebody's going to apply, yes, we do have to look at that. How we can address that, I'm not sure. That would be a hell of a challenge for the Commission. But certainly it's not off the table.
Any other comments on that?
Go ahead.
I would very much agree with Brian. And sure, we also need to, for intelligence exploitation, do it anyway. It's the chat rooms, though, where the interactivity, the real-time two-way communication between individuals and the reaffirmation of aberrant attitudes, and to some extent we're even seeing the perceived creation of a virtual Ummah where they don't have anyone who is denouncing some of what they're doing, so they actually start reaffirming one another. And there is something, we talked about child predators. On the net in particular, there could be 6 people, but if they start emboldening one another because they start believing that what they actually do is acceptable. It's not. It's really not. Maybe one of the things we looked at, which we couldn't come to any conclusion in our report, was whether or not the media has a role to play here in terms of exposing, like ABC or NBC, I forget which one it does, has about exposing child predators. But that would be crossing the line, Brian just said, between incitement activity where that may be against the law to do that. But I'm not suggesting we don't shut them down. If we can, of course we do. Realistically speaking, we're not going to get to everything.
Mr. al-Marayati.
Yes. Let me just segue then to the larger question the government's role, how it can help. Number one, I agree there needs to be ideological independence of these indigenous Muslim American groups that are fighting the extremism, the extremist ideology. And to associate government with that would tarnish their credibility in the community. So I agree with that. Where cooperation comes in then is, for example, the federal funding of programs that teach young students, all students, in our campuses the difference between incitement to violence and free speech. It can come also in the financing of programs for partnership between law enforcement and local communities. It can also come in the form of ad council advertisements talking about how to detect criminal activity, terrorism, and what to do. Or it can also be a positive ad council advertisement talking about the process of pluralism, the greatness of pluralism and the process of integration, especially of young Muslim Americans into our great society. So these are some of the recommendations that we have in our Muslim American Youth Report that we hope you can take a look at.
Can I make just one final?
Yes, Brian.
We have probably paid more attention and spent more money. I'm not saying it's not a noble cause, but government-sponsored effort to reduce smoking, to reduce drunk driving. Problems, to be sure, problems that kill Americans every day. But we have made it a national effort with government sponsorship to go after those issues. And we have done so without violating the Constitution. We certainly can do that much here.
I think this is an outstanding hearing, and without the committee will stand adjourned. We again thank the witnesses for a good job done. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much.
Up next on C-SPAN 2.